Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Epstein's Files and Dracula's Legacy, Keir Starmer's Drama. Whence come those mysterious influences which change our happiness into discouragement and our self-confidence into diffidence? One might almost say that the air, the invisible air, is full of unknowable forces, whose mysterious presence we have to endure. One might say that man, ever since he has thought, has had a foreboding and a fear of a new being, stronger than himself, his successor in this world, and that, feeling him near, and not being able to foretell the nature of the unseen one, he has, in his terror, created the whole race of hidden beings, vague phantoms, born of fear. Guy de Maupassant, Horla. Hi everybody, and here we have a gallery of rogues that will be the jumping off point for this talk. And anyone from outside the UK, please don't worry. I'm using the present UK government crisis surrounding. On the left there, you have Peter Mandelson, who was the UK ambassador to the US, who was appointed by the guy on the right, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister. And quelle surprise, it was in public knowledge anyway. It's bizarre, bad political judgment, but it turns out that in the Epstein Files, Peter Mandelson, the new ambassador, was besties with Jeffrey Epstein. So at the time of filming this video, huge big crisis. It's very unlikely the Prime Minister's going to last. And this is one of the latest outcomes of the Epstein Files. And what I wanted to do, though, was I'm not an expert. I don't know a lot about the whole Epstein controversy, that, you know, a granular, detailed level. But what I wanted to do was explore the ghoulishness and why we as a viewing public seem so fascinated. Obviously, it's a massive story, the Epstein Files, but there are other stories, for example, in the UK, like the grooming gang scandal, which also surrounds the same type of abusive behaviour, and yet that hasn't attracted the same level of attention. So there are issues about what's uniquely fascinating to people. Is it the money? Is it the secret networks of power? All these issues. But one thing that struck me thinking about all this was the links it has to Bram Stoker's Dracula story. And just the what's the word? There's an eeriness, there's a resonance, there's this sense of malevolence that makes Bram Stoker's Dracula such a resonant tale that's had so many recreations in the form of mostly cinema. But it's a massive presence in the collective, cultural memory of Western society, this whole notion of the vampire and the ghoulishness and the undead. So speaking of the undead, this is a quote from, it was the Guardian newspaper in the UK. They interviewed Keir Starmer just before he became Prime Minister. It was looking like he was going to win the election, and sure enough he did. And I'm calling him the undead. But one of the taglines for the article written by the journalist was Keir Starmer's most personal interview yet. So please bear that in mind. Keir Starmer's most personal interview yet. And this is what the journalist wrote. But then he can't really say if he's strictly an optimist or a pessimist. And no, doesn't know if he's an extrovert or an introvert either. I've never really thought about it. I don't know what that tells you. He doesn't know what he dreamed last night, or ever. I don't dream. Just hits the pillow at 11 and bang, is out till around 5. He doesn't have a favourite novel or poem, wasn't scared of anything as a child, nothing, no phobias. So it's a very funny article, not deliberately, inadvertently funny, where this Prime Minister appears, I'm calling him the undead, because he appears to have absolutely no personality whatsoever or normal human interests. And that made me think, it reminded me, this interview, I was reminded of it when I saw this quote from Fiona Peters. It's an academic paper, Looking in the Mirror, Vampires, the Symbolic and the Thing, which I'll be talking about shortly. But this concept of the undead, so I would argue quite strongly that that brick wall in the background has more personality than Keir Starmer. But this is what Fiona Peters writes. A dead person loses the predicates of a living being, yet he or she remain the same person. An undead, on the contrary, retains all the predicates of a living being without being one. So that's what I'm suggesting is Keir Starmer's qualification to be a proud member of the undead. But to be serious for a second, there is this, I used the word before, resonance, this eerie spookiness that, and I find it interesting that this is Nosferatu, which I think was it 1922, German film, obviously based on the whole vampire mythology. So it's only the actual novel, which I'll talk about shortly, was 1897, Dracula. So only around about 25 years difference between the novel and the film. And yet the films, there have been so many, and it's been so hugely influential, the whole Dracula theme in popular culture. But I don't know. I just think this original Nosferatu, and I'll be showing pictures later on of Bela Lugosi, or Lugosi. I find the earlier black and white, the use of shadows like this, actually the most effective, even though in cinematic terms they're probably the most primitive. But talking about, and this is the only proof thing we have that Epstein wasn't an actual vampire, is you can see his reflection in the mirror. But this is part of the photographic evidence that Petey, as I think he was known by Epstein, Peter Mandelson, who became, as just to repeat, the UK ambassador to the US. This is them shopping. And later on, perhaps, I might get the chance to talk about the way in which I think, because I'll be talking about psychoanalysis, I think Peter Mandelson is a fully card-carrying narcissist. I think Epstein's more complicated than that, because I don't think he needed to be in the public eye. He liked to be around incredibly powerful people. But I just think this photograph encapsulates the narcissism of Peter Mandelson, being very, very obsessed about his image in the public eye. So I just can't conceive of a universe in which I'd be that bothered about the technicalities of a white belt. I don't think I've ever worn a white belt in my life, but he just seems, from what I have read about Peter Mandelson, incredibly obsessed about clothes. I think there's, in the Epstein Files, mention of going shopping for underwear, again, something I've never done. Probably says more about me than Peter Mandelson, but I'm just fascinated by this, the amount of attention paid to a white belt. But this was, it's Murnau, I think the director was called F.W. Murnau. Apologies if I mispronounced that. And this is Count Orlok, who's obviously based upon the concept of Dracula. And I think the titles, the word, how to describe it, the narrative text they put up, the intertitle descriptions of what's going on in the film before sound, this was the quote: "And at that moment, as if by miracle, the sick no longer died, and the stifling shadow of the vampire vanished with the morning sun." So this part of the vampire mythology, the idea that sunlight, there's a phrase, isn't there, sunlight cleanses, sunlight gets into darkness, and in the public cultural memory there's this idea of sunlight as a purifying force. And I was reminded of this image when I saw the next one, and I do warn you that the next one will burn itself on your retina in not a pleasant way. This was Peter Mandelson, who in UK political circles was known as the Prince of Darkness. So this is all part of the relevance I'm trying to build with the concept of Dracula, how Dracula can help us understand. And in a sense, in this instance, I just mentioned, the sunlight coming in and being a disinfectant. This picture was one of the things that led to Peter Mandelson's downfall. So in terms of the vampire mythology, there was this cleansing effect. The sunlight did do for the Prince of Darkness. But having a reputation known as the Prince of Darkness, it's a bit of a come down, isn't it? That this is being seen in your Y fronts as part of your political legacy. So from now on, what I'm going to do is, I will talk about Jeffrey Epstein, I will give some examples of his links to the whole vampire mythology, how you can maybe better understand him. But I'll also be using some psychoanalysis, and to show you how the psychoanalytical theory of how our consciousness works was prefigured by the vampire mythology that's contained within Bram Stoker's Dracula, but also the Guy de Maupassant story that I led with, the epigraph from Horla. This story that isn't technically about a vampire, but I think there are very strong links. So I will be doing separate videos on some of these themes because there's just too much to go into. And the whole concept of Lacanian split subjectivity, which is a mouthful, I'll only give you a very brief overview. And like I said, if there's enough interest, I'd happily do more on Lacan because I do find it fascinating. But just in terms of this diagram, the imaginary, which I'll be talking about shortly, is all to do because it links to the vampire mythology, because it has a link to the concept of what's known as the mirror stage, seeing yourself in a mirror. And remember, vampires aren't seen in mirrors. The imaginary, it's not about imagining things so much as the imaginary realm of reality, according to Lacan, is to do with images. The images we have of ourselves that start off as a child when you first recognize yourself in the mirror, and I'll show examples of that very shortly. The symbolic is to do with language and how we position ourselves in society and within our families. And then the real is the last bit, and you can see how interwoven, it's called a Borromean knot, this interwoven geometric shape on the left. The real, by definition, is everything that's left over that isn't accounted for by the symbolic and the imaginary. So it's what lies outside of language. It can't be directly described, but it exists in the shadows of our experience. So the real is a great way of thinking about vampires. And as we'll see, I'll explore how you could relate the concept of vampires and the whole narrative and mythology to figures like Jeffrey Epstein, Mandelson, and the whole downfall, or what looks to be the downfall, of the Keir Starmer government. And right in the middle, on the right-hand side, you can see in that flatter diagram, the two-dimensional one, there's a little A right in the middle of the diagram that Lacan called petit objet, or le petit a, and it refers to petit objet a, little object A, which I'll be explaining. But if you could just bear this in mind, this little diagram, because this little A, I'm suggesting this is what is the main aspect of the whole vampire mythology, and to some extent, this is how I'd try and understand Epstein, the phenomenon. And we can all be amateur psychologists or psychoanalysts, but it just strikes me that this fixation right in the middle of this diagram, I'll explain petit objet as we go along, but it's this thing that in and of itself, it's nothing. It's right at the heart of our reality, and it's what our experience circulates around. But it's the best, simplest way I think of describing it is, it's not desire, it's the desire of desire. It's like the person you might have, I've encountered a bloke in the past who I think he was engaged 6 or 7 times. So it was never really the object, i.e. the woman he wanted to marry. It was the process of getting married he seemed obsessed by. So he kept circulating, and it was this little impetus for desire was actually more important than the object of desire, if that makes sense. But anyway, so this was just to set it up. This is just to show you again, if you could keep this in your mind, I think this is a great way of thinking about A, vampires, and B, how Jeffrey Epstein's psychology could be compared to or resonates with the concept of a vampire. So this is a photograph of Bram Stoker, as you can see, from 1906. The Dracula novel came out in 1897, and that's quite an interesting time because I think Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came out in 1886, so 11 years earlier. War of the Worlds was H.G. Wells' book that I've spoken about on the channel, was 1898, so a year afterwards. So it's a fascinating era, the Victorian era, where there was a lot of repression. If we're going to talk about psychoanalytical ideas, a lot of repression, a lot of things pushed down. I thought it's what gave the British an empire, was the fact that we were completely emotionally constipated. Everything got repressed and pushed down to a dark little box within us. And unlike today and today's culture, we didn't let it out. So obviously it caused great mental anguish, but it gave us an empire. And that's a joke, by the way. But this is what I wanted to also convey. Guy de Maupassant wrote this story 10 years before Dracula, which I find interesting. And again, I just think it sheds light on some of the aspects of Epstein, the psychology, and how people like Mandelson, who surrounded him, some of how all this could happen. So Horla, it's what they call a portmanteau word. It's a new word made up of a combination of others. So Horla, as you could see, hors outside and Allah there in French. So it's this vague sense of outside, somewhere there. The outsider, the outer, the one out there, the what's out there. It's quite a deliberately vague phrase. And I'll be quoting from this because I think it's incredibly relevant. I'll give you specific examples in a second, but it's very close to some of the themes of Bram Stoker's Dracula. And then if you want to check it out yourself, Boule de Suif was 1880, and I think it's Guy de Maupassant's most famous story. It's a short story, and I think in the translation is suet dumpling or butterball, and it's used to describe a courtesan. And I won't give you the whole plot. It's a short story, and I advise you, thoroughly recommend you to check it out. But it's a brilliant story to show hypocrisy and social double standards. And why I mention it is, if you think of the Epstein Files and what they reveal about networks of power, all of this is predicated, people looking the other way, people not paying attention to the abuse of young women and, underage girls. All of this stuff requires double standards, sanctimonious social hypocrisy, all of these things, which I think are brilliantly covered in this short story. But without more ado, I want to quote from you Horla, Guy de Maupassant's story, to show you how 10 years before Dracula, the type of psychology, this fear of something that's simultaneously threatening us from the outside, but actually, this will be part of my conclusion at the very end, plot spoiler, but this idea that what's threatening us from the outside is actually something that lies within us. So it's written, this short story, Horla, and it's online, and again, I'd thoroughly encourage you to read it. It's written as a journal entry, like Dracula also is. So this is May 25th. No change. My state is really very peculiar. As the evening comes on, an incomprehensible feeling of disquietude seizes me. Just as if night concealed some terrible menace toward me. Then I go to bed and I wait for sleep as a man might wait for the executioner. I wait for its coming with dread, and my heart beats and my legs tremble, while my whole body shivers beneath the warmth of the bedclothes, until the moment when I suddenly fall asleep, as a man throws himself into a pool of stagnant water in order to drown. I do not feel this perfidious sleep coming over me as I used to, but a sleep which is close to me and watching me, which is going to seize me by the head, to close my eyes and annihilate me. I hope I'm not alone in just seeing this as incredibly relevant to this fear of the ghoulish vampire that always appears at night as this spectral presence. And to repeat, this is 10 years before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. And I don't, please tell me in the comments, but I don't think it's a particularly well-known story, which in a certain sense surprises me that it hasn't been picked up on by more people. So July 4th, I'm decidedly taken again, for my old nightmares have returned. Last night I felt somebody leaning on me who was sucking my life from between my lips with his mouth. Yes, he was sucking it out of my neck like a leech would have done. Then he got up, satiated, and I woke up, so beaten, crushed, and annihilated that I could not move. So this is a male protagonist who, as the short story progresses, becomes more and more psychologically disorientated and disturbed. And I think it's just self-evident that, you know, the sucking of the neck, sucking it out of my neck like a leech would have done. I'll be giving you, you know, pictures later on of vampires in action. But all of this goes to, you know, the dark depths of the psyche, which I think is what makes people respond so readily to the vampire stories. This is Castle in Romania. And this notion of the id lying, you know, this deep, primeval, dark forest of the id. It's in fairy tales, so I might have mentioned earlier in the channel, I once gave a talk to a bunch of undergraduates, and I think I traumatised them for the rest of their lives by talking about the Little Red Riding Hood, what it actually means, the fairy tale, and how it's significant that it's based in the deepest, darkest depths of the woods where Little Red Riding Hood goes to see her gran, or is it? And in terms of the Epstein story, you've obviously got this island that obviously is a lot sunnier than Transylvania, but the same, you know, dark, isolated place. And then in New York, I think this was his residence at 9 East 71st Street in Manhattan. And the idea that I'm seeing the links to Dracula, you know, this baronial front to the brown. It's not. I was going to call it brownstone. It's not a brownstone, is it? But you get my idea. It's this, you know, for American standards, very old, well-established, significant-looking house. And it's not just me. This was a note that Woody Allen, so you know, the company people keep, but this is Woody Allen, a typed note that he wrote about having stayed at Epstein's. And this is the transcriptions to save your eyes. Being neighbours, my wife, he could have also said adopted daughter, Sun Yi, and I have been invited for dinner many times. This is to Epstein's mansion. Always accept, always interesting. Wide variety of interesting people at every dinner, just about. Politicians, scientists, teachers, magicians, comedians, intellectuals, journalists, an entomologist, a concert pianist. Anyhow, it's always interesting, and the food is sumptuous and abundant. Lots of dishes, plenty of choices, numerous desserts, well served. I say well served, often it's by some professional houseman, and just as often by several young women, reminding one of Castle Dracula, where Lugosi has 3 young female vampires who service the place. And to this, that Jeffrey lives in a vast house alone, one can picture him sleeping in damp earth. So just to reiterate, it's obviously, I'm not alone. I keep good company in the sense that Woody Allen shares my interpretation that Epstein has this air about him that is quite, you know, reminds you of Dracula. Sun Yi tactfully, she initially the food situation was quite dire. He didn't really provide, and Woody Allen described how Sun Yi encouraged him to provide better food. So this all improved because of Sun Yi's intervention, and he says the large phone and computer at his right hand does take some of the relaxed home cooking atmosphere out of it, but one can't have everything not Castle Dracula. And then this is one, again, at the Manhattan Mansion, the baronial type of decor that he's gone for, the look. Everyone needs a stuffed tiger. And the idea of, this is the 1931 Universal film just called Dracula, but the three women that Woody Allen's referring to, Dracula's three brides. And it goes without saying that Epstein was surrounded by this fetish of young women. And this is from pictures of inside the mansion as well. You know, truly bizarre. And then this is another picture of one of the rooms. And I'll come back, if you notice the chess set on the right-hand side, I'll come back to that later. But if you look in the background above the fireplace, the painting, so this is, it's an unknown artist. Apologies if my research has been poor, but it's signed Melia. But as far as I know, they haven't identified the actual artist. I just thought it was interesting because it reminds me of German Expressionism. You wonder to what, it's almost like Dorian Gray as well. You wonder to what extent Epstein mischievously saw a bit of himself in it. And then another, the title of this painting, this was in the estate of Epstein. And it's a New York-based Australian artist, apparently, Patrina Ryan Clyde. And the painting is called Passing Bill. So I'm pretty sure the blue dress is an allusion to the Monica Lewinsky scandal. And this is just completely by the by. This is slightly tangential, but this is also by the same artist, called War Games, just to show I'm bipartisan. So this is George Bush Jr. Now, before I go into a deep dive, and just to show that I'm quite eclectic with the sources of some of my material, I am genuinely fascinated. One of my guilty secrets, I read a lot of Amazon reviews and sometimes mischievously contribute under an anonymous name. But this was the title, reader for the novel and the useful chapter notes. So this, I need to be out and open. The Guy Reed Brown, he's already pressed my buttons because I went to university in Edinburgh and I was surrounded by double-barreled, surnamed, inbred, very well brought up, very privileged, very rich, best education money could buy before they came to university. But I'm very articulate in a very posh way, but not particularly bright, and with inordinate amounts of unjustified self-confidence. So just to show I'm not bitter. But this is the context from which I'm reading this. So this was the title, read it for the novel and the useful chapter notes. It is a handsomely produced artifact, well printed. Ignore the preface and introduction, which are the usual socio-political impositions by academics, inverted commas, because apparently academics don't really exist, who should never be allowed anywhere near the 19th century Gothic literature. It simply gives them the opportunity to spout irrelevantly about gender roles, colonialism, immigration, Christian morality, blah, blah, blah. I'm currently reading the 19th century vampire anthology Dracula's Guest, compiled by the American Michael Sims. He shows how it should be done and explains the roots of Stoker's Dracula far more effectively than the Penguin scholars do without it even being Dracula, with a better writing style and with much broader terms of reference, including a scientific background and, most importantly, a true love of the Gothic genre, in and of itself, and not as some Freudian metaphor for the Victorian suppression of sexuality or whatever. Yes, well, I very politely and profoundly disagree 1000% with Guy Reed Brown. And the irony of all this is he's obviously got this knee jerk reaction to a deeper analysis of these type of stories, which ironically means he's in denial, which is one of the things that psychoanalysts teach us about. So, in his very rejection of psychoanalytical type interpretations, he's inadvertently illustrating the actual usefulness of psychoanalysis. But passing that irony for 1 second, it reminded me of this quote from Marshall McLuhan. So, this was the Duke of Gloucester at the time. And Edward Gibbon, the author of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, had published one volume and then presented this aristocrat with a second volume. I don't know whether he was hoping for sponsorship or just to keep well in with the Lord, but this was the response that Marshall McLuhan in Understanding Media quotes from. So this is the Duke of Gloucester's response. Another damn fat book, eh, Mr. Gibbon? Scribble, scribble, eh, Mr. Gibbon? So with our double-barreled friend who gave the negative Amazon review, there is a long, ignoble tradition in English culture, particularly, of overprivileged inbreds who don't approve of cultural writing. So I just want to get that out there before we dive into the deeper analysis. So to say that it's wrong to say that Dracula's about Victorian sexuality and so on made me think of this. This is the Carl Dreyer 1932 film Vampire, and this is just a screen grab. But obviously, there's no deeper sexual interpretation that could possibly be made of that image, is there? No Guy Reed Brown, whatever your name was. And again, just to show you how off kilter anyone who's doesn't like deeper interpretations of why Dracula, vampire mythology, Epstein, the whole psychodrama that's currently surrounding the British government. I do just find it fascinating if you actually go to some of the initial literary sources and then start tracing how revealing they can be. Because the whole Epstein scandal, at its deepest level, yes, you can talk about power and so on, but obviously it's about sexual exploitation. It's about either repressed sexuality or far too much sexuality. How you could escape those conclusions is beyond me. So I just think there's an obviously legitimate reason for looking at the literature and comparing it to some of the recent events. Because I think the danger is if you just look at current events, you get caught up in them, and it's who said what to whom, and it's the minutiae when the deeper underlying patterns get passed over. So without more ado, this is chapter 16 of Dracula. It's where they, I think this is where they see Lucy, who eventually they kill, who was one of their party, the protagonist party. My own heart grew cold as ice, and I could hear the gasp of Arthur as we recognised the features of Lucy Westenra. Lucy Westenra, but yet how changed. The sweetness was turned to adamantine, heartless cruelty, and the purity to voluptuous wantonness. He overuses the word voluptuous, by the way. I actually think Bram Stoker's not the best writer in terms of technically. So I'd argue Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is better written. So I think something like Wuthering Heights as well has some gothic elements, and I think that's better written. But anyway, that's by the by. So this voluptuous wantonness. By the concentrated light that fell on Lucy's face, we could see that the lips were crimson with fresh blood, and that the stream had trickled over her chin and stained the purity of her lawn death robe. We shuddered with horror. When Lucy, I call the thing that was before us Lucy because it bore her shape, saw us, she drew back with an angry snarl, such as a cat gives when unawares. Then her eyes ranged over us, Lucy's eyes in form and colour, but Lucy's eyes unclean and full of hellfire, instead of the pure, gentle orbs we knew. At that moment, the remnant of my love passed into hate and loathing. Had she then to be killed, I could have done it with savage delight. As she looked, her eyes blazed with unholy light, and the face became wreathed with a voluptuous smile, again with the voluptuous. But one of the reasons I wanted to quote that for, I just think it's interesting again, and yes, of course, it's a fictional novel, but I mentioned Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde earlier on, the idea that the double nature of human psychology, the double nature of a person's character. And I just think that Gothic, by definition, Gothic literature is an exaggeration, but it's an exaggeration of what? I would strongly argue it's an exaggeration of tendencies that are within our normal lives. And that second paragraph, I think, describes if you're ever in a violent argument with, and it's ironically, it's more often a loved one because they're the people who can get under your skin. It's more difficult to have, really virulent argument with a relative stranger because you don't have the emotional investment. But when you see another side of someone, so existing within the same person, there may be little hints you get in extreme circumstances. And I think that is part of the Gothic appeal. We know to some degree that what Gothic literature is about our everyday reality, but it's just Gothic literature exaggerates and brings out what's hidden. So talking about what's hidden, this again is from Nosferatu film 1922, and the actor in the coffin is Max Schreck. Again, he's the vampire Count Orlok. But this argument that what Gothic literature is actually about is real human psychology rather than just phantoms. So remember the epigraph from Horla, I talked about the phantoms, or it was one of the earlier quotes, it may not have been the epigraph, but the idea of the phantoms, yeah, it was the epigraph, God, I'm going senile. The idea that we have these phantoms outside of us, or we project, we make our fears into phantoms. So that was from Horla. And this is Van Helsing talking in Dracula of what a vampire is. He can do all these things, yet he is not free. Nay, he is even more prisoner than the slave of the galley, than the madman in his cell. He cannot go where he lists. Or should that be wishes? I'm wondering whether... Anyway, he who is not of nature has yet to obey some of nature's laws. Why, we know not. He may not enter anywhere at the first, unless there be someone of the household who bid him to come. Though afterwards he can come as he please. His power ceases, as does that of all evil things, at the coming of the day. So again, just in reverse order, at the end, this idea, the coming of the day, the daylight disinfects the evil of night. So at the most primeval, basic atavistic level, vampire mythology, it's about darkness versus light. But this idea that he may not enter anywhere at the first, there's a line in Lost Highway, the David Lynch film, where the man in black is this, basically the character, he's acting as the superego of the protagonist who goes mad. And he comes out with a line, I believe, from my terrible memory, but he basically says, I can only go where I'm invited. And I think that's a nod to this quote, this idea that the vampire can't go anywhere, only where he's invited. So it introduces the idea of the idea that it's not purely an external force. It goes to this idea that it's got some psychological truth. It's something that lies within us that's invited in. And this was just something that I did a brief mention of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari in the previous video. And of this time, so we're talking Dr. Caligari was 1920. Hypnotism, again, Freud, the notion of the subconscious, all of these ideas were very, very prevalent. And it just interests me that it was 1897 when Dracula was written. in a very short period from 1897 into the 1920s, you have this interest in the subconscious, hypnotism, what lies within us, and how we project onto the outside of ourselves. So in Dracula, this notion of what's in ourselves and what's deep within us, the coffin as a metaphor. The thing in the coffin writhed, and a hideous blood-curdling screech came from the opened red lips. The body shook and quivered and twisted in wild contortions. The sharp white teeth champed together till the lips were cut, and the mouth was smeared with crimson foam. This is the killing of Lucy. But Arthur never faltered. He looked like the figure of Thor as his untrembling arm rose and fell, driving deeper and deeper the mercy-bearing stake, whilst the blood from the pierced heart welled and spurted up around it. Yeah, regarding that Amazon review, I honestly don't see how anyone could see any sexual interpretation of this type of writing. There in the coffin lay no longer the foul thing that we had so dreaded and grown to hate, that the work of her destruction was yielded as a privilege to the one best entitled to it. But Lucy, as we had seen her in her life, with her face of unequalled sweetness and purity. True that were there, as we had seen them in life, the traces of care and pain and waste, but these were all dear to us, for they marked her truth to what we knew. Once and all, we felt that the holy calm that lay like sunshine over the wasted face and form was only an earthly token and symbol of the calm that was to reign forever. It interests me in this, the thing is, this is one of the points about vampire writing. It's the idea that the vampire represents what otherwise can't be represented. It's called the thing. It's this, remember the middle of that Lacanian diagram, petit a. It's the vampire represents total desire, and maybe you could see the links there with Epstein. Total desire. With Mandelson, it was total desire for power. For Starmer, it's total desire, this thing-like obsessive need just to stay in power, no matter how little of it he's got left. But it just lends itself. I can't think of many literary genres that lend themselves to such obvious psychological corollaries. So that, you know, the whole notion of the bat-like, nocturnal, blood-sucking. This is Bela Lugosi for the 1931 film Dracula. And this is a stretch, I totally understand, but I just thought of this when I saw an aerial picture of Epstein Island. It just struck me as quite bat-like, but beginning to see bats in my sleep, so to speak. But just a little bit more on psychoanalysis before we get into directly the Epstein type stuff. Freud took a paradoxical word, unheimlich, and showed that instead of being opposed to its opposite, heimlich, homely, instead of pointing to threat from outside, is in reality nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old, established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. So this is one of the things I find interesting. Epstein is a multimillionaire, or was. He mixes with the most famous and powerful people in the world. So to that extent, he's completely divorced from your average person's experience. And you look on as a, you know, bemused spectator at the lives of the rich and famous. Likewise, the vampire figure is alien, it's supernatural, it's external to us. But the question is, that's identified here, this notion of the unheimlich, the uncanny. If you follow the German etymology, it's based upon the unhomely. And it's this paradoxical thing there, what seems strange and external and supernatural has its roots in what's inside us, the homely. So I don't think people would be as fascinated about Epstein, or for that matter, vampire mythology, if there wasn't a subtle element of it that's true for all of us. And obviously someone like Epstein represents the absolute extreme. But I suppose there's a question of, given that much power, given that much money, given that much liberty to do whatever you want, it's a bit like The Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad, where Kurt, at the very end, the horror. What would you do if you had access to that level of power without, for a long time, any responsibility or any consequences for your actions? One of the most relevant aspects of the uncanny is the way in which it circumvents knowledge. In other words, we might think monsters, vampires, aliens don't exist, but that doesn't diminish the uncanny effect they have on us, for example, in literature or film. The mechanism at play is not that we are frightened by what can come to get us from without, but that we are forced too close to that sublime point of mingled pleasure and pain that is the object within ourselves, projected outside. I think that's a brilliant insight. And when I was reading this, these are links on this channel I try to make, is with visual art, because you get, I keep overusing the word resonance, but I can't think of a better word. This cross-fertilization of conceptual insight about the things that can't be fully described that nevertheless exist, the thing, das Ding in German. That we know these things and these entities exist behind everyday reality, but the whole point of these things is they can't be described using language, but that doesn't mean they don't exist as psychological, subconscious, id-like processes. And so I just think this is brilliantly written, and this made me think of this. It's called Child and Large Bird from 1912 by a German artist, Emil Nolde, Nolde. And he was this is always one of the perennial issues about art and the nature of the artist. Nolde was a despicable human being who was an enthusiastic supporter of that. I can't use the word because you risk getting in trouble on YouTube, but the little Charlie Chaplin looking man in the 1930s in Germany, you know who I'm talking about. So he was in that period, he was classed as a degenerate artist, but that didn't stop him from being a massive supporter of the euphemistic nasty party. And I just think this is a brilliant illustration of that idea of the projection of your inside, fears or spectral property. And there's a vaguely funny story. Angela Merkel had one of Nolde's two, I think, paintings in her office. And when they found out that loads of documentation came out, a bit like the Epstein Files, that showed Nolde was up to his neck in anti-Semitic views and so on. And she had the paintings removed. And I think she had them replaced by a couple of paintings from Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, who was also a painter of that time. I think he was So she had these other paintings brought in, but it turned out he also was very supportive of the nasty party. So there was this idea that you can account for the goodness of an artist. I just think doesn't really work. But to move on, this is a brilliant... I think he died in 2011, but Friedrich Kittler. And the subtitle of this whole talk, Dracula's Legacy, it's a essay in this collection. I think it was written originally in German in 1982, and this edition is from the English version in 1997. But I don't have time to go into lots of detail. I would like to do more on just purely the essay, Dracula's Legacy. But one of his basic themes is, in the 1800s, he wrote a book called Discourse Networks 1800-1900. And what you have is this idea of the mother teaching the young children to read and write. So this actual painting's called Mother and Children Reading, Arthur Boyd, Houghton, I think it was, circa 1860. But Kittler says, so he's talking about the mother taught reading and writing and how it turns into word processing. When the one mother gave way to a plurality of women, when the alphabetization made flesh gave way to technological media, poetry also disintegrated. So what Kittler does in this book, Discourse Networks, is trace how, I'll explain why all this is relevant in a second, but the way in which we learn to read and write used to be from our mothers. And that's important when you think of the vampire idea, this oral fixation, biting and sucking, because your first relationship to your mother that psychoanalysts would track is this idea of being breastfed, and you're not even conscious of your mother as an individual human being. It's just you being breastfed in perfect contentment, and then the rest of your life as you grow up psychologically is being ripped away from that absolute bliss, and everything's downhill from then on. I apparently was bottle fed, so that explains a lot. But I've emphasized here this notion of word processing. It's interesting in the recent scandal that Keir Starmer, every time he's asked an ethical question along the lines of how could you employ someone who was best pals with Jeffrey Epstein, I'd challenge you, if you ever watch any news, count the number of times he uses the word process or process related. And it just struck me as quite ironic. But Kittler's talking about the way in which technology begins to adapt and take us away from the link to our mothers in this case. But more generally, this notion, remember, unheimlich, unhomely. Culture and society used to be based around much closer ties, and word processing, the technologies of print start to take us away from it. So this is the penultimate paragraph of Dracula. I took the papers from the safe where they had been ever since our return so long ago. We were struck with the fact that in all the massive material of which the record is composed, there is hardly one authentic document, nothing but a mass of typewriting, except the later notebooks of Mina and Seward and myself and Val Helsing's memorandum. And this is what Kittler, he takes the whole essay, Dracula's Legacy, takes a really interesting perspective that what Dracula's all about, to some degree, is about the way, because he's captured, Dracula is actually caught by the efforts of Mina Harker and the way in which women of that time stopped being the people who stayed at home and taught their children to read and write and went out into the workplace with this new technology. So this is a picture from Britain in the 1930s, the type of office, the filing system. Kittler points out Dracula's caught by people with loads of files and records of his movements. So to continue with Dracula, the moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind the room was light enough to see. On the bed beside the window lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed and breathing heavily as though in a stupor. Kneeling on the near edge of the bed facing outwards was the white-clad figure of his wife. By her side stood a tall, thin man clad in black. His face was turned from us, but the instant we saw, we all recognised the Count in every way, even to the scar on his forehead. With his left hand he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. Her white nightdress was smeared with blood, and a thin stream trickled down the man's bare breast, which was shown by his torn open dress. The attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a saucer of milk to compel it to drink. So again, notwithstanding overly posh Amazon reviewers, the whole point here is that this, and this is Kittler's argument, this breastfeeding motif, it's explicitly here. But this is obviously reverse. It's the vampire feeding somebody else. And the way in which this seeps into popular culture, this was a surreal excerpt from, it was a series in Britain called Little Britain, a comedy series. And the running gag was this very middle-class woman regularly fed her adult son, breastfed him. And he'd ask for bitty, he wants bitty, which, given the biting of vampires, you can see how this all begins to link together. What the vampire represents is this original moment, the baby breastfeeding, this, remember the diagram, the little a, objet petit a is the little object a. The mother's breast is this little object that the baby associates with total pleasure. And the rest of your life as an adult is spent in some ways trying to recapture that bliss, which you never will. Because the price of being an adult is, this picture accepted, is that you can't have that infant bliss ever again. What you gain is entering the symbolic realm of adulthood, being able to use language, being able to take part in society. But you lose this primeval, atavistic, basic bliss and basic process of being fed. The vampire represents feeding whenever it wants to in this type of way, which is beyond mere mortals, because the price we pay to enter society is to leave this behind. So you've gone from the mother, though, being the individual, the link with the child, being, teaching the children to read and write. And this is what the typewriter did. This is from Detroit in the 1940s. And if you think of the way in which vampires proliferate, they infect more vampires. And this is what Kittler's suggesting is underlying in Dracula, is these are the social processes that were taking place that Bram Stoker's representing in a different Gothic form. This fear of what was happening to traditional society, this spreading of the new technology that was doing away with the old order. And the vampire becomes this ambiguous character because he's the one who sleeps in the earth of his original homeland, but he's also the one that brings this new infection. And now it's time to talk about the mirror stage. So the mirror stage is when the baby first recognizes itself. And Jacques Lacan argued it was between 6 to 18 months. And what's vaguely amusing is that chimpanzees can recognize themselves in a mirror, but they quickly get bored. What's interesting is human babies are fascinated and they don't get bored. So narcissism, you could argue, is baked in when we first recognize ourselves. But according to Lacan, it's what you'd call a misrecognition, because yes, that is our reflection, but to play with words, it's not a true reflection of who we are, because who we are is much more complicated than a simple reflection that can be presented in an image like this. So in his essay, Jacques Lacan says, indeed, for imagos whose veiled faces we analysts see emerge in our daily experience, and in the penumbra of symbolic effectiveness, the specular image seems to be the threshold of the visible world. If we take into account the mirrored disposition of the imago of one's own body in hallucinations and dreams, whether it involves one's individual features or even one's infirmities or object projections, or if we take note of the role of the mirror apparatus in the appearance of doubles, in which psychical realities manifest themselves that are moreover heterogeneous. So what he's suggesting is, this is one of the fundamental things that happens to us in our psychological development. But as adults, it continues. These images we have of ourselves in our own psyche, And this was actually, Jacques Lacan took this photograph. It's his wife holding their daughter, I think she was called Carolyn or Caroline. And this was in 1937. But then compare this to Guy de Maupassant again, Horla. And I'm mentioning all of this because I'm describing the way in which human psychology works. But we'll shortly see, vampires don't see themselves in mirrors. And to the extent that Jeffrey Epstein has these vampire-type qualities, he wasn't involved in this type of recognition of yourself, even if it's a misguided recognition. He was purely about desire. He saw himself reflected in his victims, like the vampire does. He didn't need to go through this process. But this disorientation of when you can't see yourself in a mirror, this is in Guy de Maupassant again. I got up so quickly with my hands extended that I almost fell. Horror. It was as bright as that midday, but I did not see myself in the glass. He was talking about looking in the mirror. It was empty, clear, profound, full of light, but my figure was not reflected in it, and I was opposite to it. I saw the large clear glass from top to bottom, and I looked at it with unsteady eyes. I did not dare advance. I did not venture to make a movement, feeling certain, nevertheless, that he was there, that he would escape me again, he whose imperceptible body had absorbed my reflection. So he fears he's lost his reflection, he can't see it. And this causes the protagonist in the story, Horla, to lose his mind. What I'm getting at is that Jeffrey Epstein is the type of psychological character who this didn't bother. He went with this rather than being shocked or upset by it, this process. How frightened I was. And then suddenly I began to see myself through a mist in the depths of the looking glass, in a mist as it were, or through a veil of water. And it seemed to me as if this water were flowing slowly from left to right and making my figure clearer every moment. It was like the end of an eclipse. Whatever hid me did not appear to possess any clearly defined outlines, but was a sort of opaque transparency which gradually grew clearer. At last I was able to distinguish myself completely, as I do every day when I look at myself. I had seen him, and the horror of it remained with me and makes me shudder even now. So this is the return of Dracula, 1958. Notice no reflection in the mirror. And in the actual book, Dracula, I started, for it amazed me, Jonathan Harker is shaving in the mirror. I started for amazement I had not seen him, since the reflection of the glass covered the whole room behind me. In starting, I had cut myself slightly, but did not notice it at the moment. Having answered the Count's salutation, I turned to the glass again to see how I had been mistaken. This time there could be no error, for the man was close to me and I could see him over my shoulder, but there was no reflection of him in the mirror. The whole room behind me was displayed, but there was no sign of a man in it except myself. "Take care," he said. "Take care how you cut yourself. It's more dangerous than you think in this country." Then, seizing the shaving glass, he went on. "And this is the wretched thing that has done the mischief. It is a foul bauble of man's vanity. Away with it." And opening the heavy window with one wrench of his terrible hand, he flung out the glass, which was shattered into 1,000 pieces on the stones of the courtyard far below. Then he withdrew without a word. It's very annoying, for I do not see how I am to shave, unless in my watch case or the bottom of the shaving pot, which is fortunately of metal. So this inability or anger when he encounters a mirror. Again, this is Keanu Reeves, who in terms of being an undead actor who shows very little emotion, would be perfect for the role of actual Dracula. Vampires have no need of a mirror image as metaphors for the threatening thing representing the real, in other words, that which can't really be truly represented. The antagonism the human subject experiences is negated for the vampire. The vampire, the Brian Epsteins of this world, they don't have to deal with how you interact with your own self-perception, the ideal eye, it's called, of your mirror reflection, or the ego ideal of how you interact in society, how you're seen by other people. Epstein and the vampire devote themselves fully to the pursuit of their desire. And this is just a throwaway joke, but it's from Zizek. It's therefore clear why vampires are invisible in the mirror, because they have read Lacan and consequently know how to behave. They materialize objet A, which by definition cannot be mirrored. So this is the thing, the vampire and the Jeffrey Epsteins of this world represent pure desire. Pure desire can't be seen, can't be represented. So this is the House of Dracula from 1945. Again, back to Horla. This time I'm not mad. I have seen, I have seen, I have seen. I can doubt no longer. I have seen it. I was walking at 2 o'clock among my rose trees in the full sunlight, in the walk bordered by autumn roses which are beginning to fall. As I stopped to look at the Jeanne de Bataille, which had 3 splendid blooms, I distinctly saw the stalk of one of the roses bend close to me, as if an invisible hand had bent it, and then break as if that hand had picked it. Then the flower raised itself, following the curve which a hand would have described in carrying it toward a mouth, all about the mouth again, and remained suspended in the transparent air, alone and motionless, a terrible red spot 3 yards from my eyes. In desperation, I rushed at it to take it. I found nothing. It had disappeared. Then I was seized with furious rage against myself, for it is not wholesome for a reasonable and serious man to have such hallucinations. So he's really losing the plot. I spent a terrible evening yesterday. He does not show himself anymore, but I feel that he is near me, watching me, looking at me, penetrating me, dominating me, and more terrible to me when he hides himself thus than if he were to manifest his constant and invisible presence by supernatural phenomenon. So Guy de Maupassant here is basically describing what Bram Stoker then does. Bram Stoker takes this inner pressure and expresses it as an external phantom vampire figure. And again, with the Epstein case, to what extent do we? I totally accept that Epstein was an extreme example, but to what extent is at least part of our fascination some type of subconscious recognition that we share what we're projecting, our interest we're projecting onto the Epstein character, pure evil, out of control, supernatural type evil, when actually, at least at a much lower level, some of these traits are within us all. I just thought this was a quite clever promotional. This is Bela Lugosi doing his makeup in promotional photos for his film, but the joke being that he's not supposed to be able to see his reflection. So Guy de Maupassant again, August 14th. I'm lost. Somebody possesses my soul and governs it. Somebody orders all my acts, all my movements, all my thoughts. I am no longer master of myself, nothing except an enslaved and terrified spectator of the things which I do. I wish to go out. I cannot. He does not wish to. And so I remain, trembling and distracted in the armchair in which he keeps me sitting. I merely wish to get up and to rouse myself, so as to think that I am still master of myself. I cannot. I am riveted to my chair, and my chair adheres to the floor in such a manner that no force of mine can move us. Then suddenly I must I must go to the foot of my garden to pick some strawberries and eat them. And I go there. I pick the strawberries and I eat them. Oh my God, is there a God? If there be one, deliver me, save me, succour me, pardon, pity, mercy, save me. Oh, what sufferings, what torture, what horror. It's almost Beckett-like when he goes into the stream of consciousness. I got up so quickly with my hands extended that I almost fell. Horror. It was as bright as at midday, but I did not see myself in the glass. It was empty, clear, profound, full of light, but my figure was not reflected in it, and I was opposite to it. I saw the large clear glass from top to bottom, and I looked at it with unsteady eyes. I did not dare advance. I did not venture to make a movement, feeling certain, nevertheless, that he was there, but that he would escape me again. He whose imperceptible body had absorbed my reflection. How frightened I was, and then suddenly I began to see myself through a mist in the depths of the looking-glass, in a mist, as it were, or through a veil of water, and it seemed to me as if this water were flowing slowly from left to right, and making my figure clearer every moment. It was like the end of an eclipse. Whatever hid me did not appear to possess any clearly defined outlines, but was a sort of opaque transparency which gradually grew clearer. At last I was able to distinguish myself completely, as I do every day when I look at myself. I had seen him, and the horror of it remained with me, and makes me shudder even now. So I'm repeating some of this, but I just wanted to re-emphasise this sense that your reflection's being absorbed. I began to see myself through mists in the depths of the looking-glass. And why I repeated this at this particular point was I wanted to remind you of that. So you can look at images like this, the bar at the Folies Bergère from 1882. And you've got the whole of the society of that time in Paris. You've got this, there isn't a reflection where it should be of the man talking to the woman. And this idea of spectral projections that we make in our split subjectivity, according to Lacan. Notice, I've mentioned this, I did a little bit on this in a very early video in the channel, but notice that the front view of this woman, who's presented as a commodity, look at the red triangle of the flowers on her chest, what do they call it, the décolletage, and compare it to, in the bottom right hand corner, the Bass beer has a red triangle. And the Bass beer, that logo, I think was the first ever commercial logo. So the woman's been presented as a commercial object, the whole Epstein modus operandi. And see how the man in the top hat's to the side, and in the other corner, the left hand corner, there's another man in a top hat in the distance looking. But the back of the woman in the reflection, she's missing an earring, and she looks broader and less idealized than the front view. So even Manet, this is 1882, before Horla, before the Dracula, there's some of this spectral, that image doesn't work in purely reflectional terms and physics terms. So what does it mean? So I'll begin to finish off with this idea of, I've started on the channel looking at Byung-Chul Han's work in various forms, but this book, The Transparency Society, and the whole Epstein thing started with the Epstein Files, the Transparency Act, November 2025. So the link to me was quite obvious. And Byung-Chul Han says, compulsion for transparency flattens out the human being itself, making it a functional element within a system. There lies the violency of transparency. Clearly, the human soul requires realms where it can be at home without the gaze of the other. It claims a certain impermeability. Total illumination would scorch it. This is what happens with vampires. And cause a particular kind of spiritual burnout. Arguably, Epstein suffered from a complete spiritual burnout. Only machines are transparent. Eventfulness and freedom, which constitute life fundamentally, do not admit transparency. So, again, this is from Nosferatu, the little friendly rat on his arm. But the idea that, to some extent, the vampire represents the last refuge of what isn't exposed, what can remain hidden in a society that's increasingly totally about transparency. So in Dracula, there's a constant theme of the dark and what escapes the light. So this is when the boat comes into Whitby Bay. But strangest of all, the very instant the shore was touched, an immense dog sprang up on deck from below, as if shot up by the concussion, the boat coming in other words, onto the shore, and running forward jumped from the bow on the sand, on the sand, making straight for the steep cliff where the churchyard hangs over the laneway to the east pier, so steeply that some of the flat tombstones, thrusteins, or through stones, as they call them in Whitby vernacular, actually project over where the sustaining cliff has fallen away. It disappeared in the darkness, which seemed intensified just beyond the focus of the searchlight. So in terms of Byung-Chul Han's transparency, there's the darkness, which seemed intensified just beyond the focus of the searchlight. And just use another Nolde illustration. It's called The Fishing Boat, Red Sky, 1916. So Bart identifies, this is Roland Bart in this book, Camera Lucida. Bart identifies two elements of photography. He calls the first studium. It concerns the extended field of information that is to receive notice, that very wide field of unconcerned desire, of various interest, of inconsequential taste. I like, I don't like. Think of all the likes on YouTube or basically online, liking or disliking. It belongs to the order of liking, not loving. Its form of judgment reads, I like it, I don't like it. It lacks all force or passion. So in vampire terms, contact has not quite been made. The second element, punctum, breaks through studium. It does not give rise to liking, but causes injury instead, emotion and concern. Unary photographs have no punctum. They offer the object of studium alone. Unary just means a single component or element. I think they use it in maths. News photographs are often unary. The unary photograph is not necessarily tranquil. In these images, no punctum. A certain shock, the literal can traumatize, but no disturbance. The photograph can shout, not wound. These journalistic photographs are received all at once, perceived. So the punctum, the actual teeth, make contact. And I'm using studium and punctum. I'm making a literal association, the notion of puncturing. Art punctures in a way that photographs and mass-produced images don't. The punctum interrupts the continuum of information. It expresses itself as a rift, a fracture. It constitutes a site of utmost intensity and density, inhabited by something indefinable. It lacks all transparency, the evidence that distinguishes studium. The incapacity to name is a good symptom of disturbance. The effect is certain but unlocatable. It does not find its sign, its name. It is sharp and yet lands in a vague zone of myself. So art is about vagueness. Art is about lack of clarity. I'll be giving you examples specifically of Jeffrey Epstein in a second, but his island where he indulged his desire. Byung-Chul Han explains this as we go along, that it's the sign of narcissistic inability to distance yourself from desire, and art typically provides an aesthetic distance. whereas Epstein and the powerful and the rich that he surrounded himself with circumvented that. So this is the Bran Castle again, and that's a photographic, professionally taken photograph. But it lacks, that's the studium, according to Bart. It lacks the punctum. And the next image, it's another Nolde, but it's not even a castle. But I'd suggest it's much more atmospheric. This is the house and cross in the mountains. And what I like, this is called Mountain Landscape, also known as Blue and Green, another Nolde. So that's mountains. It's often Nolde pictures, it's indiscernible, the difference between mountain scenes and seascapes. But these are all about the punctum. They're not about the studium. And to give you a further example, one of the greatest and suddenest storms on record has just been experienced here, with results both strange and unique. Before the sun dipped below the black mass of Kettleness, this is again when the boat's coming in with Dracula on it into Whitby Bay, standing boldly athwart the western sky. Its downward way was marked by myriad clouds of every sunset colour, flame, purple, pink, green, violet, and all the tints of gold, with here and there masses, not large, but of seemingly absolute blackness, in all sorts of shapes, as well as outlined by colossal silhouettes. And that just reminded me of this. I just think it's a stunning painting. This is called Sea with Evening Sky and Sailing Boat, 1930. This is Autumn Sea, number 5 from 1910. They're all Nolde at the moment. Studium involves reading. It is by studium that I'm interested in so many photographs, whether I receive them as political testimony or enjoy them as good historical scenes. For it is culturally, this connotation is present in studium, that I participate in the figures, the faces, the gestures, the settings, the actions. If culture consisted of particular figures, gestures, narratives, and actions, then the pornographication of the visual today would take place as deculturalization. Pornographic, deculturalized images offer nothing to read. They function like advertisements by direct, tactile, and infectious means. So this is the link between Epstein as a representative, a vampiric representation of broader social trends that are infecting us. The crisis of our times is not acceleration, but rather the scattering and dissociation of temporality. Temporal dissynchrony makes time buzz without direction and disintegrate into a mere series of punctual, atomized presences. Therefore, time becomes additive and is emptied of all narrativity. This is what I'd argue Epstein's mentality is reduced to. Time becomes additive. It's a series of constant repetition, emptied of all narrativity. He and the other powerful people did not care at all about the life stories of the women he abused. It's the temporal dissynchrony, time buzzing without direction, a mere series of punctual atomized presences of women to be abused. Ghislaine Maxwell's house rules that I've referred to in a previous video. There's this bizarrely, weirdly specific structure of everything that had to happen on that island. Intimacy eliminates objective room for play in order to make way for subjective stirrings of affect. Objective signs circulate in a ritual ceremonial space. This space cannot be narcissistically cathected. In a certain respect, it proves empty and absent. Narcissism expresses distanceless intimacy with oneself, that is, lack of self-distance. Narcissistic subjects who lack the ability of scenic distanciation populate the society of intimacy. So again, Epstein is the archetypal father, this Dracula type figure who populates or controls the society of intimacy. The way Byung-Chul Han is describing this is that art provides a distance, scenic distanciation, whereas the more pornographic way that Epstein constructed his environment is the exact opposite. And to give you a very specific example, this was the chess set I referred to earlier. On the left, that was Epstein modelling because he turned himself and the women he abused into figurines on the chess set. So this is Richard Sennett, he's quoting Chul Han. The narcissist is not hungry for experiences, he's hungry for experience. This is Epstein. Looking for an expression or reflection of himself in experience, he devalues each particular interaction or scene. According to Sennett, narcissistic disorder is on the rise because a new kind of society encourages the growth of its psychic components and erases a sense of meaningful social encounter outside its terms, outside the boundaries of the single self in public. So there's this egotistical explosion, this narcissism that doesn't require a social order. This is why Epstein creates his own environment on the island, his own weird mansion in Manhattan. It's like a completely separate, closed-off world. Intimate society does away with the ritualistic ceremonial signs through which one might escape oneself, lose oneself. So art and culture help escape oneself, lose oneself. Epstein created this world where he immersed himself and the others who wanted to partake in this experience. The complete narcissistic non-engagement with the wider symbolic order. Experience means facing the other. Experiencing, in contrast, means encountering oneself everywhere. The narcissistic subject cannot fence itself off. The borders of its being grow hazy. In consequence, no stable self-image emerges. The narcissistic subject melts into itself to such an extent it proves impossible to play with identity. Grown depressive, the narcissist drowns in his borderless self-intimacy. No void or absence distances the narcissist from himself. So I'd say this is John William Waterhouse, 1903, Echo and Narcissus. This is what art does. Narcissus has lost himself. Echo, though, is portrayed in this painting, and this painting has depth. So grown depressive, the narcissist drowns in his borderless self-intimacy. No void or absence distances the narcissist from himself. In this painting, you can see the distance in the background and between him and Echo. That distance is what art provides. And this is Caravaggio, 1599. This is him showing what was just described, the complete lack of distance. The knee here is the hub of this complete circularity between Narcissus and his own reflection. There is no real distance that was shown in the previous painting. This is the Epstein psychology. This is the vampire circling around their own desire for just yet more blood, more victims. But this, at least, is what eventually did happen to Epstein and potentially Peter Mandelson. But to completely finish now, this is the very final bit of Dracula, Mina Harker's journal. As I looked, the eyes saw the sinking sun, and the look of hate in them turned to triumph. But on the instant came the sweep and flash of Jonathan's great knife, the killing Dracula. I shrieked as I saw it shear through the throat, whilst at the same moment Mr. Morris's Bowie knife plunged into the heart. It was like a miracle, but before our very eyes, and almost in the drawing of a breath, the whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight. I shall be glad as long as I live that even in that moment of final dissolution, there was in the face a look of peace such as I never could have imagined might have rested there. And if I ever do a full video on Dracula, I think it's an ambiguous ending. They don't kill him according to the rituals that Van Helsing describes during the book. The whole body crumbled into dust and passed from our sight. And there's lots of evidence that I could go into in which they're not totally reliable witnesses, the people who write all the different journals, the different perspectives in Dracula. I just think it potentially, just throwing it out there, it's wishful thinking that actually Dracula is dead. The castle of Dracula now stood out against the red sky, and every stone of its broken battlements was articulated against the light of the setting sun. This is Null Day again, Dark Red Sea from 1938 roughly. And then I think this ending of Horla, the Guy de Maupassant, is actually, this is how I read the end of Dracula. Dead, perhaps, his body was not his body, which was transparent, indestructible by such means as would kill ours. It's interesting, the transparent, which is Hans' argument. If he were not dead, perhaps time alone has power over that invisible and redoubtable being. Why this transparent, unrecognisable body, this body belonging to a spirit, if it also had to fear ills, infirmities, and premature destruction? Premature destruction. All human terror springs from that. After man, the Horla. After him who can die every day, at any hour, at any moment, by any accident. He came. He who was only to die at his own proper hour and minute, because he had touched the limits of his existence. No, no, there is no doubt about it. He is not dead. And I prefer that reading because, as we've seen from the Epstein Files, as we're currently seeing in British politics, even if the sunlight temporarily disinfects, the darkness never truly goes away. No, no, there is no doubt about it. He is not dead. Till next time, all the very best.